Greetings, friends. I was watching a compilation of Nirvana TV appearances on YouTube, and I want to share one of the comments which I read underneath. Some guy called Mike Noble says, quote, "Memories. Kurt Cobain was totally right back when he used to say rock is dead. Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, etc. were indeed the last wave of real, good, honest bands. My daughter, 16 years old, likes some of today's, quote, rock bands, some really cheesy shite. I try to think, well, if I was her age now, would I like this and that, which is on the television? You know, I just don't think I could or would. It's emo garbage. WTF. Anyway, sorry if I come across like a grumpy 37-year-old man. I just wish our youth had bands like Nirvana, as I did in my teens, to take you places that were awesome." End quote. And I have to agree with this random guy, Mike Noble. I mean, he's 6 years older than I am, so I didn't really, become aware of these bands until I was already in the early 2000s, when I was already in my mid-teens by that time, and a lot of these bands were already history. But then I was starting to get into it then, but of course, regardless, I was old enough to grow up as a kid in the 90s, and you'd see what's on television, you'd see what's on Much Music here in Toronto, or I guess you had MTV in the States, or just what's on the radio. It was a different time. There was just totally different music. And I totally agree with him. We are living in a music desert right now. So people may say, no, there's good music, there's good artists, and sure, but they're here and there, they're oases in what's otherwise a barren landscape. It was very fertile, in a fertile culture environment for music throughout the 90s, but that just has to do with Generation X coming into its prime, coming into its adulthood. Now, today, what do we have? Oh, Maroon 5. I don't even know. I don't have a television. I don't have a radio. So I don't know. But it's a different time. I'll talk more about the internet later. But what do we have today? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Leave your comments. What do we have? Well, Maroon 5. They've already been around for years. But that's a good example of total shit. That's a good example of emo shit. It's not rock, whatever you want to. They may use guitars and a bass. It's not anything I would recognize. So anyways, what are the generations? Of course, maybe there's endless generations. What was the generation that that fought the world wars? But after that was the baby boom. We've all heard of that. 1946 up to 1964, that's 18 years. That's a long generation. A lot of kids being born in the post-war period. And then, of course, Generation X was anyone born from 1965 to 1980. And that includes most of the people that were in these bands, which I'm going to talk about in just a second here. And then, of course, I'm a millennial. Millennials 1981 to 1996. Some people push it a bit further to early 2000s even. So it's a little unclear where Generation Z, or whatever they're going to call the new generation, whatever that's going to be, when it starts, it's starting in the early 2000s. Doesn't really matter, because we're concerned with Generation X here. So what were the famous Generation X bands? And when were their stars born? So I don't want to bore you. I just want to give you some birth dates here and list my list of the top tier bands. Some people are going to disagree with me, but if an artist you like doesn't make this list, it's not because they're not quality. It's just as you have to define what's a popular band. There has to be a cutoff point. So this is my list. I would say Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, born in 1967. Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day, born 1972. Zach De La Rocha from Rage Against the Machine, born 1970. Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins, born 1967. Dexter Holland from The Offspring, born 1965. Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, born 1965. He's still going strong. Tom York from Radiohead, born 1968. I think they're still producing music. Chris Cornell from Soundgarden, born technically a late baby boomer, born in mid-1964. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam is also a late baby boomer, born in just at the end of 1964. Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, born in 1967 again. There's that year. Scott Weiland from Stone Temple Pilots, born again 1967. Liam Gallagher, Noel Gallagher, the older brother, also born in 1967, but the younger Liam in Oasis, the British rock band, was born in 1972. Marilyn Manson, also known as Brian Warner, born 1969. So there you have it. There's my list. But it gives you that concise time period where all these guys are born. Yes, there was still some good music being produced in the early 90s, like Depeche Mode. Killing Joke was doing their thing. They never rose too popular, but you know, Depeche Mode was pretty popular, but they're a bit older. They're actually born, they're slightly 4 or 5 years older than these Generation Xers. So you could start this list with some people being born in 1960. So I do hear talk of how the late baby boomers do share more of a connection with Generation X. But for the sake of this list here, I had to be concise. So those are strictly the Generation Xers, with the exception of Eddie Vedder and Chris Cornell. Just barely. So grunge, I mean, you could talk about alternative, you could talk about industrial, but generally we want to start with grunge, and that's all I'll really talk much about here. I won't really talk about all the others too much, but you know, grunge, we have the word grungy today, grungy clothing. I don't know if you know more about the music history, where did the word come from? Did it exist before that? Before that movement? Was it not popular until after that movement? But they wore grungy clothing, loose clothing. And they had dark lyrics. It was a dark kind of music, not overall dark. Not all their songs were dark, but overwhelmingly there was a dark, ominous feeling to it. It was a very raw, very loud sound. Not that there wasn't loud metal music in the 80s too, but this was really loud at times. I'm not just talking about Nirvana, but you could basically, I mean, of course, it's arbitrary. These labels are very arbitrary. Everyone would disagree, but you can see how you might want to group Nirvana closer to Stone Temple Pilots, closer to Soundgarden, and of course Alice in Chains. In fact, Alice in Chains sounds similar to Nirvana. The vocals, that's the thing about this. Grunge bands are very unique in many ways, although the vocals, impressive vocals, but they did tend to sound the same from band to band. Like Lane Staley sounds very similar to Kurt Cobain, sounds somewhat similar to Scott Weiland, somewhat similar to Chris Cornell, although Chris Cornell had a very high vocal range, so he could differentiate himself that way. But there's a similar way they sang, very different from punk, from other types of rock, even from metal. So then there was this rebellion of grunge, and perhaps some of these other movements too in the 90s, a rebellion against the mainstream 80s hair metal, kind of the corporatized, popular mainstream shit. And we were familiar with mainstream shit today. Maybe it wasn't quite as bad back then, but it was still very bad by the end of the 80s. I couldn't give you any good examples because why would I want to look into shit bands and listen to that stuff? But we all know it existed. And so then there were the goofy antics of the grunge. Maybe I'm not just talking about Nirvana, but they do give a good example. You know, goofy antics. They would just do silly. They'd goof around. So maybe it wasn't completely dark, but they did have this like childish side to them. I mentioned their loose and ragged clothing. Pearl Jam, they wore very loose and ragged clothing in the early 90s. You know, the ripped jeans, all that stuff. I'm not saying that this stuff didn't exist before. I'm just sort of trying to paint the image of how it looked at the time. But I would say very extremely creative music. Grunge was very creative, at times kind of even psychedelic with their guitars. But not too far, not too artsy, nothing like that. I mean, maybe the Smashing Pumpkins were kind of an artsy crowd, but basically the good rock songs, well produced. The bass is doing a good job in the right place. The guitar is doing a good job in the right place. And, you know, you can tell that because a lot of these bands were just three-person acts, where the vocalist also plays a guitar, and that's all. That you only have one guitar, and then you have a bassist and a drummer, and that's it. Then they weren't all like that, of course. Some of the bands had two guitars, but generally very simple. Everything was doing its part very well. Well-produced music. I mean, we have good production techniques today, but I wouldn't say that necessarily musicians today, despite the fact that the rock is dead, I don't know if they really put the elements together in such a good way and have the catchy, sick, ill riffs which were being produced 20 years ago. I just don't see it today on any wide scale. I mentioned the vocals tending to sound the same, but and another thing I would mention about these early 90s grunge bands is that they were deliberately being obscene. I'm not chastising them for that, but you know, they were kind of obscene, like they're breaking your instruments on stage, wearing dresses. I don't know why. Like you see that in the Smashing Pumpkins video today. You know, today is the greatest. Billy Corgan is driving an ice cream truck through the desert as the music's playing, and then he picks up this guy, James Iha, his guitarist, but in the video, he's some guy on the highway wearing a dress. So what's this thing with men wearing dresses in the early 90s when was it just to thumb their noses at the conservatism of the 80s, of the somewhat conservative 80s, even though the 80s wasn't entirely conservative, but was it somewhat more conservative culture? Were they thumbing their nose at that? Were they just having fun? Because you also see Nirvana wearing dresses in at least one of their music videos. It just looks really like, it puts me off looking at it now. It's like, why would you do that? Even at the time it'd be weird. But anyways, so nothing wrong. So there was a double rebellion. There was a rebellion against the hair metal, corporatized mainstream rock of the 80s, and then there was also just a rebellion against conservative norms. But needless to say, this couldn't last very long because it's kind of dark music. It's kind of going to blow its way out. So of course, this sort of thing couldn't last more than a few years. And of course, by the mid-90s, late 90s, there wasn't this grunge thing so much anymore. It had moved on to something else. And the last thing I would say, which is connected to this, is that grunge, not all the alternative rock, not all the industrial, all the other cool stuff, electronica, but something about grunge was self-destructive. Maybe that was just the artists. Maybe that was just the lifestyle, because there were a lot of drugs and a lot of depression amongst some of the musicians, especially the lead singers like Kurt Cobain. He died in 1994 from blowing his brains out with a shotgun. He would have died from heroin anyways, because he had so much heroin in his system that they can't even figure out how he pulled the trigger, but he did blow his brains out. And then there was Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, who lasted longer, but he sort of just withdrew by the late 90s, became isolated, and in 2002 they found him dead. He was in his apartment dead for more than 2 weeks. His body had been decomposing, but they determined that he died from cocaine and heroin together. And it was just a sad ending. And he also died in early April, like Kurt Cobain. And so it's kind of interesting. They sounded very similar, so that was kind of a little spooky there. But Scott Weiland lasted longer from the Stone Temple Pilots, but he died in 2015 at the age of 48. That's not like he became an old man. And who knows what actually killed him, but he had a long history of drug use. And Chris Cornell from Soundgarden died last year, apparently from suicide, and just like one day after having a concert with his whatever band he was in at the time, not Soundgarden, but some other band. Apparently his bodyguard found him in his hotel with like a rubber band around his neck and blood in his mouth, and he was taking some prescription drugs, but I don't know what. That's kind of sad. So anyways. But, the rest of these guys, some of these guys are still doing their thing. I mean, of course, I should have mentioned that, the oldest Generation Xers are 53 years old, and the youngest are 38. So it's not like they're old geezers. I mean, so many of them are still producing good music today. Like Billy Corgan is still doing his thing, although I was never really into any of his music. But clearly music is vastly different now than 20 years ago. It's vastly, vastly different. So there's my little thing about grunge in terms of alt rock and industrial. I can't say too much, but, industrial Nine Inch Nails. I don't know if you've heard of V&V Nation. Check them out. They're pretty good, but they didn't reach that top-tier popularity level. They're kind of more of a cult band. And then alt-rock, that could, Radiohead. I don't know if you would put Oasis in alt-rock. They might just be called rock. They weren't trying to do anything too fancy, too artsy. That's what I respect about Oasis. What I was saying earlier. But, just good rock songs, a good catchy riff. The bass is doing its job. The percussion's powerful. It's just a powerful sound. It's well-produced music. It's not too complicated. Go listen to Oasis, at least their early albums. And then, so that could be kind of rock, alt-rock, industrial. Marilyn Manson was almost kind of the goth rock mixed with some, industrial is, we're talking synthesizers. It's no longer rock. So Trent Reznor, he's an amazing guy. He's intelligent, and he mixes all the different styles, but he always uses synthesizers. And then he'll incorporate the bass, he'll incorporate guitars. Later on, he even makes a new band every time he goes on tour, but Nine Inch Nails has basically always been Trent Reznor. So, the importance of television and radio, and purchasing CDs, of course, TV and radio have always been very important. It still is, but this was before the internet, so you had to go and buy a CD. And something that Billy Corgan was talking about in his interview with Joe Rogan is that they did a scientific study that people will form a connection with an artist when they purchase a CD from that artist. or any songs on the internet. Just the act of purchasing makes you want to scrutinize your product because you paid money for it, so you want to pay more attention to it to see, are they delivering value to me? And if you do decide that, yeah, this is valuable, then you're going to get into a more of a faithful relationship buying CDs or whatever products from that artist in the future. But of course, people don't buy CDs as much as they do anymore because of the internet age. The internet changed the game. So what kind of music was evolving by the late 90s, early 2000s? Well, grunge was gone. Rock, as Kurt Cobain would say, was already dead, but of course it was changing. There was even rock and hip hop mixing, and hip hop itself was going sort of mainstream. Not like the majority of Americans or Canadians listen to hip hop as their main music, but in some strange way, hip hop became the mainstream thing that all the corporations were spreading, and you'd hear it on the airwaves, and you'd hear it in movies, and the youth were becoming more influenced by that sort of hip hop culture. Even though I think the quality of hip hop actually went down, it just got turning into garbage club music, whatever. But once you heard bands like Coldplay, once you heard music like Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park, or Korn, once you heard any of those four bands, you knew this, number one, this was shit music, and it was the end. The good times were over. So what kind of bands exist today besides those ones I listed? Well, Limp Bizkit's not around anymore. But, today, 2017, again, I don't really know. I mean, the Arcade Fire, Maroon 5. I mean, Arcade Fire has a few good songs, but overall, a very weird band. Too artsy. Just overproduction. Like, they went too far. It's good to have well-produced music, but they have like it's not simple. It's not simple at all. Okay, and they're out of touch with the culture completely out of touch. Even if you're in Canada, you may have heard of Matthew Good. He's also born in 1971, a Generation Xer. He's always been to the left. That was cool in the late 90s, but now he's like just on the anti-Trump train, Trump derangement syndrome, because I've seen one of his music videos. It's basically making fun of Donald Trump. And I know the Arcade Fire, they weren't too happy that Donald Trump got elected. It's like, come on, man, if you're a musician, you should be a bit smarter. You should at least, you may disagree, but you should at least have an idea what the common person is feeling. It's not good for your future as a musician. Anyways, I'm getting beside the point here. So if you go, what about MTV? It's totally devolved. You go on their YouTube channel, nothing is even for music there on their YouTube channel. I'm scrolling down, all I'm seeing is just reality drama bullshit, teenagers, just brain dead stuff. So as Kurt Cobain said, rock is dead. So the issue is not that the great Generation X bands couldn't keep the music coming. It's not their fault. I mean, I have the utmost respect for Generation X. Generally, you guys are pretty cool. My generation, the millennials, I don't have any respect for this generation. It's not great. My own generation kind of sucks. And so, but I want to refer to something that Billy Corgan has to say about what happened from his point of view about this sort of thing. But for me, the issue is not that it's not that the Generation Xers couldn't keep the music going, because that's impossible. But the issue is that no younger generation rose in their place to carry the tradition forward. And that's very sad. So why did the kick-ass music go away? I mean, who knows? But I can identify three factors. Of course, number one, Generation X got older. Number two, the zeitgeist changed. The zeitgeist is like the spirit of the times, the spirit of the age. More like the spirit of the times. Spirit of age is kind of like a longer time period, but it changes a lot, and that's something that an artist can get in touch with and then lose touch with. And then number three, the internet changed the game, as I mentioned. With the internet, it became harder for artists to make money, obviously, because you can just go and stream music online. When you can just get individual songs on YouTube or some other streaming website, there's less impetus for you to listen to the whole album or even to look for the other songs. You sort of look for just what you find nice, and of course, you don't think so much about buying it, because why buy it when you can get it for free? I mean, we're all guilty of this, right? It's just natural. The internet totally changed the game, so that had something to do with this. But, I mean, in themselves, none of these factors could prevent new people from creating good music. I mean, the kick-ass music, it did go away. But couldn't we have music that was just a little less good? I mean, why did music have to start sucking so badly? Just really sucking. Who knows? I mean, that's a mystery. There was quality music from the 50s to the 90s. It was a totally different culture. I can't comment before the pre-war. That's different. I don't like jazz. In the 19th century, who knows? I mean, there was none of this stuff. Okay, there were no electronic instruments. It didn't exist. So I can't comment on that. Just in our modern time period, there was good music for decades and decades, and something terrible seems to have happened by the late 90s and early 2000s. Something terrible happened to our culture and to our music, and we're in a music desert. So there was quality back in those previous decades. I may not have liked all of this music at the time if I went back in a time machine and listened to it, but I would have recognized there was a quality there. The artists had something to say, generally, unlike today where no one really has anything important to say. Or not important, but just anything that resonates with an average person. I mean, how many intelligent lyrics can you find today? Well, maybe the average person isn't intelligent. You know what I'm trying to say? There's just no resonation either way. So I want to finish by quoting something which Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins had to say when Joe Rogan interviewed him recently. So he was elaborating on what he calls his respect for the zeitgeist effect, the spirit of the ages, or the times. And he says, quote, "There's something about when it all seems to make sense, the public's fascination, the artist's place in time, the work that's being created. There's a sense of familiarity, but also something is happening, and everybody wants to take part in it. The ego of the artist wants to convince yourself that you're always in that moment, and that's just impossible. That's just impossible. There's no way. It's just the cyclical nature of creation. Hasta luego, amigos."